Good evening, everyone. I'd like to take about 10 minutes and go over the results of my 5-day lesson sequence. Here's an overview of the topics that I'll cover for this evening. Most of these are lined up directly with what was the requirements for the lesson laid out in the syllabus. I chose to set up the lesson on the topic of weather and climate since it's a topic that I was most familiar with and could build with very little lab access, not knowing what I would really have in the classroom that I'm simulating. I chose Appleton North High School as my notional classroom location. In order to build the daily lesson plan, the assumption I made was that the class would run 5 days a week for a 50-minute period. Now, I don't know what the actual frequency and the length of the real Appleton North science classroom is, but I think the 5-50 split is probably comparable if they were on a 3-day-a-week, 90-minute class schedule. I chose to address two NGSS standards that most closely fit the topics I planned on teaching. There were 4 in the original NGSS standard. Number 1 and number 3 did not fit the sequence topics that I was trying to execute. I noted that I have some weak connections between my lesson and the interpretation of the standards, and I found myself having to reshape some of those daily lessons to fit them into the intent of what the NGSS standard was actually calling for. The cross-cutting principles that were published with the NGSS standards were fairly lengthy. I was able to touch on a few of the cross-cutting concepts, but not all of them. With further revision and collaboration with the teaching teams at my school, I know that the total number of connections can be increased. I looked into the standards for the state of Wisconsin just to see if there were any. I used the Wisconsin Model Academic Standards and NGSS content analysis posted on the D2L website. Found that the NGSS standards, according to this report, met or exceeded the standards for the state of Wisconsin. Therefore, I found no need to target any additional standards. Building on some knowledge I picked up during Reading 435, I addressed the need to integrate literacy and language into the lesson sequence by using several tools such as graphic organizers, bulletin boards, word walls, and the integration of vocabulary lists in both the formal and informal assessments. In order to accommodate the needs of the ELL student, I would theoretically use graphical learning aids. So for example, in addition to the standard word wall, the addition of a picture by the word that can help the student associate what they see with what the demand of the language task is. So for example, if I put up a certain type of cloud next to the word that describes that cloud, the ELL student can in their mind be able to visualize what the meaning of that word is. Additionally, it may be useful to translate the English word to the student back to the student's first language on occasion, where the graphical technique isn't working. A tool such as Google Translate is my translator of choice and the one I'm most comfortable using. From personal experience, from learning and living overseas, I've learned that Google Translate does not give a perfect translation 100% of the time. However, the meaning of what you're trying to say is generally not lost, and the receiver can almost always figure out what you're trying to say. Next, I think extra care can and should be taken when grading the work of the ELL student. Extra feedback on the spelling, sentence structure, and the use of vocabulary words deserves ample written and oral feedback in order to help correct and reinforce the student's literacy habits. And finally, the 5 key concepts that I wanted the students to master during the week are spelled out very clearly so that the language requirements are put into context for what I'm trying to get at in the bigger picture. Try to insert a variety of assessments throughout the sequence. Informal assessments consisted of warm-up exercises which hopefully would force the student to recall past knowledge, whether it be yesterday or last year, and highlight to me where they need more instruction, all the way through the process of simply observing and listening to the students' oral and written communications on a very informal basis. On the topic of formal assessments, we pretty much confined this group to a series of entry and exit tickets during the week, and then finally their capstone project at the end of the sequence. While the entry and exit tickets would assess a narrowly focused range of topics, probably what we covered the day prior, possibly the previous year, and then the final written project will be a summative assessment. That final project task was given to them with the instructions that they're to imagine that they're a city planner in any city around the world. And due to changes in the climate at their once flourishing city, It is now becoming uninhabitable due to poor economics, scarce water supplies, and inefficient accommodations for the comfort of humans. Their job is to redesign a new city that accommodates the changes in the climate and hopefully calls the student to action to reverse some of the trends that led that city to where they were today. And I'll address some linkages to the other classes in the school a little bit later in my presentation. As you look through my lesson sequence, you can expect to have the 5 days of lessons material laid out in the following standardized format. Using a recommendation presented in the Flynn Science Safety videos, I start out each lesson with a safety topic from my safety contract. As we learned from Mr. Flynn, this reinforcement not only keeps the information fresh, but emphasizes to the students the importance of lab safety, even when we're not working in a lab during such a sequence as I'm presenting here. Additionally, incorporating this into the lesson plan provides written documentation of the frequency of how I reinforce the safety topics should there be any legal issues later down the road. The remainder of the lesson outlines follow the requirements that were laid out for us in the assignments back in the syllabus. Looking at each of these topics in a little closer detail, I'd like to highlight a few points. First, with respect to the standards that correspond to the lesson, as I mentioned earlier, I tried to pick ones that most closely matched what we were trying to accomplish. The standards were so broad that they didn't fit exactly, however, I do believe I met the intent of what they were trying to achieve. Additionally, I looked at benchmark standards to fill gaps where the NGSS standards didn't match up. I'll explain later how I selected my benchmark standards. Formal assessments were mixed up through the week, and I've listed here a few examples of the types that I used. I want to jump to the ELL accommodations next. I'm attempting to do my assessment across the spectrum of listening, speaking, reading, and writing. Through this sequence, I'm always listening to what the student is saying. I want to hear how they're using their vocabulary and general presentation of the English language. Likewise, their reading comprehension is just as important. I've woven in opportunities for students to read material and provide their feedback on what they read. In their written or oral presentations of what they have learned, I have the opportunity to identify where their assessment of the material is incorrect and then interject with a clearer understanding of what the language actually said. So for example, if I ask them to read a passage and then read back to me what they think the message of the author is, if they provide the wrong meaning of what the author is trying to say, I can work through the actual meaning with them and figure out where they've lost the meaning through the vocabulary or their general understanding of the English language. Finally, their written work provides me an opportunity to give objective written feedback to how that they're using their literacy skills. The day-by-day structure of my lesson is highlighted here. I'd like to point out day 0 activities. Taking a cue from something I observed in the spring at a school I shadowed at during Reading 435. In the sub-school I was at, each teacher had a sign posted outside their classroom that announced what book the teacher was reading that day. The idea was to set a good example for the students and encourage them to read along with you. During day 0, I'm setting the stage for the students to have a positive attitude about reading when I assign them short pieces associated with their assignments. Through the week, I'm using a variety of technology. While the internet, smartboards, and MS Office applications are normal day-to-day tools, the use of Google Forms adds some complexity to the technology used behind the scenes to administer assessments. Simulations help bolster the understanding of certain topics in the lessons. And finally, I threw in a QR code linking to a text set during day 2. The use of the QR code might be somewhat controversial depending on the school's policy for the use of smartphones or tablets in the classroom. I think, however, the QR code can be more than just a convenience. While I've used a URL shortener through the sequence to get rid of the long and ugly URLs associated with shared documents, the QR code can offer an even more accessible and convenient way of accessing the information I want them to look at. However, this particular text set in my sequence is being used for an extra credit project. If the student thinks that since it's extra credit, they can ignore the information, the QR code might lure them into changing their mind. If you put a QR code out there in an environment where there needs to be a legitimate reason to use a smartphone or a tablet in the classroom, we might coax the student to scan the code purely out of curiosity. They don't want to go around the rest of their life not knowing where the QR code would have taken them. If they look at the text set, they might be interested in drilling deeper into any of the material I'm presenting. The other student we might latch onto is the one who can't resist scanning any code he sees. We know what curiosity did to the cat, but the student might just benefit from their curious habits. And when we do allow them to explore the technology, we also teach them how to responsibly use the technology in the classroom for something other than texting, chatting, or other inappropriate actions that have driven the administrators to limit their use. As for missing resources, I don't know what I don't know. I kind of had to make up what I thought might be missing. I figured that some schools may not have a textbook or sufficient books for each student on the topics that I'm covering. And likewise, not all classrooms may have the hardware necessary to do the demonstrations that I want to conduct. As I thought about what I wanted to put in my reflections, I was convinced that what I did was build 5 separate lessons, but not necessarily 5 days worth of material. In reality, I probably have 5 lessons spread across 7 to 10 days of a school calendar. Second, I had to make some gross assumptions on what the students should have learned in grades 6 through 8. I looked back at the NGSS standards for middle school, and like the high school standards, they were pretty broad. I turned to the Atlas of Science Literacy to see what benchmarks the middle school student would or should have covered before coming into my classroom. From the grade 6 through grade 8 benchmarks, I followed the connectors up to the high school level to determine what my target benchmarks would be. I spent some time going back to the grades 6 to 8 to reteach some of those principles during this lesson sequence. If my class didn't need to review this, as they may have demonstrated during their entry tickets, I may be able to save some time by cutting that review out. So the benchmark standards I traced back from the Atlas to the standards outlined in the book Benchmarks for Science Literacy. In this book, the standards are presented in a much greater detail than the NGSS standards. When used with the broad definitions and the NGSS standards, the probability of hitting exactly what the student needs to know, I think, is at a pretty high. Finishing up my reflections, I found I had to force some of my lesson plan content to fit the standards. For me, making the extra connections seemed to be very hard. Next, my sequence is not very lab heavy. It's heavier in the task of data analysis. During reading 435, I picked up on the utility of Frere models to help the student organize their thoughts and main concepts. In retrospect, I could have added more of these into the sequence and guided them to having a series of Frere models completed and lead them to various conclusions that contributed to their capstone assignment. Finally, in order to especially help the ELL students, I should have thrown in a web quest. The hydrologic cycle would have been a good candidate for this. It was one of those ideas I didn't think about until a few days ago, but the web quest would have allowed the ELL to work through the topic at their own pace and level of discovery. On the ELLs, my scaffolding techniques were scattered throughout the sequence. The text set has alternate pieces of information at different reading levels. I have modeling and demonstrations to reinforce main points. There is persistent graphic support throughout all 5 days of the class through word walls and graphic organizers. There's still room for improvement, however. So for example, at the beginning of the lesson on day 1, a KWL chart would have been a great way to link prior knowledge to what we know or want to learn tomorrow. This would enforce any explicit statements that I make during the lesson, such as if I say, as I know you're aware from last year, and then proceed with whatever statement I want to make. The one point that does come through is that all students, whether they're not designated ELL or not, are certainly being stressed as academically and are all being considered academic English language learners. As I previously mentioned, the final project is one that I could see having connections to other classes. And as depicted here in the slide, I can easily see where the student can build from or contribute to the discussion in at least 5 other classes. So for example, in social studies, they can take a look at the migration of societies away from coastal regions as the sea level continues to rise. Back in history class, they can look at the wars that have been started or have been inflamed by water rights across the country, or the migratory pattern of people to find water. And then finally for English, I have a lot of writing assignments, so I'm reinforcing whatever the English teacher is trying to teach. That concludes my summary of my lesson sequence, and I look forward to receiving any questions.